Picture a world where even rain-soaked forest could burn, where one spark might turn a swamp into an inferno. The air itself was fuel, oxygen swollen to more than a third of the atmosphere, far richer than the 21% we breathe today. Every breath carried danger, but also possibility. In that charged sky, ordinary creatures stretched into giants, millipedes longer than men, dragonflies with wings the span of hawks, and scorpions the size of cats. This wasn't fantasy. It was Earth, 300 million years ago. And before we step among those titans, we have to ask, why did the atmosphere open the door for giants once, and why has it never done so again? Through museum glass, a label once declared it to be the largest spider ever. Imagine standing there, looking at a fossil slab under bright lights, and believing you were face to face with a monster that never built a web but dwarfed every spider you had ever known. What happens when stone tells us one story, and then, years later, under a different light, whispers an entirely different truth? For a long stretch of time, you could open a magazine, sit in a classroom, or see an illustration online and be met with the same image. A spider the size of a car tyre, crouched in Carboniferous swamps, waiting to spring. Posters and books called it Megarachni. Headlines repeated the myth until it hardened. Children drew it, teachers repeated it, and even people who never thought much about paleontology came away with that eerie picture cemented in their minds. A spider far larger than reason seemed to allow. But reality was not quite so grim, and in fact, makes for a more interesting story. The fossil itself had arrived from South America, cut neatly into stone slabs. At first glance, anyone, even a careful researcher, could be forgiven for leaning toward arachnid. The body plan in rock showed what looked like a rounded carapace, a segmental rear half, and a pair of shallow pits that could pass for eyes. To the human brain, primed to notice shapes we fear, this fossil screamed spider. And because so few direct comparisons were available, the idea of a giant spider in the Carboniferous felt not just possible, but persuasive. In truth, the fossil record was playing tricks at the surface. When it comes to fossils, light, angle, and preparation matter, for many years this slab was seen under only one set of eyes, from above, with much of the surrounding rock still present. The faint traces outside the main body remained hidden. Later, more work was done. Pieces of the stone were cleared, lighting made details sharper, and the orientation examined in new ways. Suddenly the spider shape broke apart. Instead of clear spider limbs, faint impressions of paddles appeared. Instead of an abdomen with spinnerets, a neatly segmented body suggested something more crab-like, armoured and broad. Layer by layer, evidence shifted the story. The telltale marks lined up not with an 8-legged web spinner, but with a group known as eurypterids. These were distant cousins of scorpions, armoured arthropods that lived in water, some of them longer than a person. In the case of Megarachni, the slab revealed paddles made for swimming, not walking. The lines of the tergites, the broad plate-like segments along the body, matched a known eurypterid pattern. The overall posture fitted a creature lying barge-like in water, legs sprawled outward for sudden movement. Once these details came into focus, the spider interpretation collapsed. So what do we have instead? Megarachni turns out to be a micteroptid eurypterid. That name sounds heavy, but the creature itself was a freshwater sea scorpion, an odd term in its own right. Picture something like a flattened armoured swimmer, its body built with shields and overlapping plates. Instead of silent stalks of silk, it fed as a sweep feeder. The broad paddles and short limbs let it rake the muddy bottom, stirring up worms, insect larvae, and other small prey. Not a web spinner clinging to trees, but a benthic feeder, skimming shadows below the surface of Carboniferous ponds. Now imagine its world. Shallow channels choked with plants, visibility low because of silt and tannins in the water. Light came down in streaks through floating mats, reeds pushed close, and the soft bottom gave way with each step. In these murky waters, Megarachne pressed forward, body close to the sediment, sweeping broad appendages through the muck until a small wriggler brushed against its armour. It lunged in small bursts, not graceful or soaring, but sudden enough to catch prey before it darted. For creatures in that layer of the food web, the danger was real, but not in the shape of a web-strung ambush in the forest. When measured honestly, the size confirmed its place. At about 1/2 metre long, it was not a spider that could cover your car windshield. Instead, picture something the length of a human forearm, with a rounder body shape closer to a dinner plate in width. To the eye, still intimidating, still alien, but far from the sprawling 8-legged terror once painted in books. For a freshwater eurypterid, that was sizable, but for a spider, practically unthinkable. The correction in scale put imagination back in its place. How did the misidentification spread so far? Partly because eurypterid fossils are scarce. Without rich comparative material, the first impressions carried unusual weight. Partly because spiders already hold a grip on our fears, so a headline calling one the largest spider that ever lived spread quickly through press and classrooms. And partly because science is human, and once a story sounds good, it can grow roots before it is tested again. Misinterpretation became a cultural echo. This is how an innocent fossil became a monster of legend for decades. Correction required work. Step by step, researchers built what you might call an evidence ladder. Start with an early impression. This looks like a spider. Test it by looking at the shape, the patterns of segments. Compare them against traits checked across other fossils. Ask what is missing. Spinneret traces, leg articulation, details of the exoskeleton. Scrape back more rock. Shine light at different angles. Look again. Share prints and descriptions with peers who may see what one pair of eyes might miss. Slowly, consensus emerges, not through sudden revelation, but through careful trial. That is how Megarachne climbed down from spider mythology and settled into its proper branch of the tree. And yet, the deeper lesson here is not just about one misnamed fossil. If even the names we give can mislead us, what about the trackways and scraps that hint at giants? What traces told stories of creatures larger than any predator, their paths pressed into mud like logs dragged by some unseen hand? Out of shadow, we move to those marks, the prints that reveal the 8-foot bodies of Arthropods. On wide stone slabs, the marks look almost too large to be real. The grooves stretch broader than a man's shoulders. Each stride carries the spacing of a body longer than a sofa. When the first of these trackways surfaced, the question was simple, almost obvious. Had some ancient beast prowled these Carboniferous swamps, a hidden hunter the size of a crocodile? The footprints invited fear. They seemed to announce a creature waiting for prey, heavier than any known land animal of its day. Scientists of the early finds, much like those who saw dinosaur tracks for the first time centuries later, leaned toward drama. The thought of a predator matched the sheer size of the evidence before them. Like human minds often do, they filled the missing body with menace. As work continued, the truth revealed itself, humbler but stranger. The huge tracks came not from a predator at all, but from Arthropods, the so-called giant millipede. This invertebrate stretched up to 8.5 feet along the ground and weighed somewhere between a large dog and a small person. Within the record of deep time, no other land-dwelling arthropod matched it in size. It remains the largest land invertebrate that ever lived. Picture its body. The back looked like a roof built from overlapping tiles. These armoured plates, called tergites, locked together in neat lines, shielding the soft tissue inside. Beneath, hundreds of legs moved in waves. When they advanced, the ripple pushed forward, row after row, each segment adding force. The motion was steady but powerful, able to lift and thrust a living beam of muscle and armour across swamp mud without sinking. If you stood in one of those Carboniferous lowlands, you might mistake the animal for a fallen trunk. Then the stump sprouted motion. Imagine it passing by, a log that carried its own rhythm, brushing aside stems as it moved. Leaves rattled against the arched back. Each shift pressed into the ground with the combined push of countless feet. The earth trembled in tiny pulses, a vibration spreading ahead of the creature like a warning. Despite the trackway's menacing size, Arthropods had no role as a stalker. It consumed the forest floor itself. These millipedes fed on damp mats of moss, layers of half-rotted leaves, and clumps of decayed vegetation turned soft from waterlogging. By grinding such matter into its gut, it transformed debris into usable nutrients, spreading fertility throughout the ecosystem. In doing so, it played the same quiet role that small modern decomposers, a worm, a beetle larva, even fungi still play today. Yet here the job belonged to a moving wall of life, a recycling engine stretched longer than a man is tall. Now why could such a form grow so grotesquely large? Partly it was constant food supply. The swamp forests of the Carboniferous produced mountains of debris faster than rot could clear it. Fallen branches and leaves formed mats upon mats. Abundance assured mass. Yet another factor breathed through the world at that moment. Air stuffed with oxygen, far beyond today's level. With every intake, the simple, unspecialized trachea of an arthropod could deliver oxygen deep into tissue that in our own time would suffocate. This high oxygen blanket opened the gate to gigantism. Herbivory offered no barrier. Instead, eating plants and detritus kept their world abundant and stable. Size itself defended Arthropods. Small amphibians crouching in the mud would have posed no danger. Even early scorpions, some nearly cat-length, could only menace smaller prey. Against 8 feet of plated bulk, their stings meant little. Armour ridges along the back gave another layer of insurance. Few creatures would dare test such a defence. Fire could threaten it, sparks chasing along dry mats. Habitat collapse could threaten it, when swamp basins shifted and drained. But for predators of flesh and blood, the giant millipede was nearly untouchable. Most of what we know comes not from full skeletons, but from their trackways. Stone floors in Scotland bear them, crossing through what was once damp mud. Germany carries others, the same ripple preserved across time. Even North America holds impressions testifying to their widespread home across Pangaea as it still formed. From each trace, the depth of a groove, the span between lines, paleontologists can read body width, guess segment count, even measure the timing of leg strokes. The animal itself may be absent, but the evidence is like an old signature stamped into clay. And yet, mystery hovers. No one has found a complete head. Without that, we cannot say with certainty how Arthropods bit or chewed. Teeth designed for slicing leaves, or grinders more fit for pulping soggy wood? We do not know. Did it burrow into mounds to lay eggs, or scatter them across the forest carpet? Did it guard its young? These answers fell into the mud and never hardened into stone. That silence stirs speculation as much as any fossil bone. When we see a recreation today, our minds bristle at the thought. A body as long as your doorway, plated in armour, feet numbering into the hundreds. Humans step backward, even from drawings. Something deep and instinctive resists the idea of so many legs moving in waves. Imagine, for a passing thought, that one survived in a present-day park. People would scatter as if a monster had wandered through. though in truth it would only chew litter and moss. Our discomfort owes more to shape than to any danger. Arthropleura's story mirrors in its way that of Megarachne. What once terrorized imagination as a giant spider revealed itself to be something else, something no less odd but far less aligned with our fears. For both creatures, early guesses from fragments built myths faster than evidence could correct them. Time and revisiting strip those myths away, leaving stranger truths. The impression of a log that walks stands vivid, even centuries after its trail broke into stone. This great millipede shows that in one window of time, the planet itself encouraged the making of giants. And just as the record reminds us, such giants relied on air itself to breathe beyond natural bounds. The trail leads from stone to trachea, from prints in mud to the breathing system of insects. So let's follow that step and ask why ordinary bugs gain the chance to push their size past the world we know. When one studies the trackways more closely, subtle details rise from the stone. Each print shows not a single foot but a faint scraping, as if the leg brushed through soft silt before rising. Together these scraps form exacting symmetry. The space between them marks hundreds of limbs working with clock-like rhythm, each motion repeating the next. The weight distribution shows how the animal shifted itself carefully to avoid sinking into mud, lifting with many legs while others supported the body lengthwise. This coordination, simple yet massive, made it stable enough to balance an armoured beam across unstable wetlands. Picture that stability in motion, every section cooperating with others. If one part slipped, others held firm. The creature spread its weight, the way a bridge distributes load over many beams. That is perhaps the best metaphor, an ancient bridge made of flesh and armour, carrying itself over swamps. The tracks, wide and deliberate, are the only maps left of that living bridge. The ecology it served reached beyond survival of one species. By breaking down masses of decaying matter, Arthropleura kept carbon cycling across the forest floor. Without such processing, thickness of piled detritus could have stifled seedlings or trapped nutrients unusable for growth. In this way, the giant millipede smoothed the ecological machine layer by layer, taking excess and returning it as fertile soil. Seen in this view, its size was not only defense but function. A large body could consume more detritus, spreading its impact across large swathes of swamp. And still, puzzle remains. Why, in all the epochs since, has no land invertebrate reached such measure again? Climate changed, food webs shifted, oxygen fell, and vertebrates grew more dominant. When amphibians and later reptiles rose, they erased much of the niche. Yet without that rare union of air thick with oxygen and forest stacked with decay, the opportunity itself never returned. Arthropleura's form grew not because of its will, but because the environment permitted, even demanded such magnitude. Remove that setting, and the giant fades forever. So, the trace slab in Scotland or Germany is not mere curiosity. It is a boundary marker in Earth's story, writing that once conditions aligned strangely, even humble detritivores reach monstrous scale. It is a lesson in how ecosystems not only shape but sometimes inflate their members into unforeseen extremes. The track itself may suggest a horror at first glance, yet in truth, the danger lay not to passer-by but to dry leaves and fallen stems. Nothing in today's forest carries quite this echo. Our millipedes remain modest, measured in inches. They continue the same role, recycling, fertilizing, but on a scale invisible compared to the giants of deep time. That is how Earth writes endings. Conditions shift, niches tighten, and what was possible becomes myth. What remains is a stone furrow across a quarry face, telling anyone who reads it that once the forest floor stirred under miles of armoured limbs. And from this question of size we turn to another. What let insects, whose breathing works so differently from mammals, break free of modern limits? The key is written not on the forest floor but inside the very air they drew, through spiracles and tubes direct to tissue. Oxygen itself set the stage, and to understand it, we need to step into the hidden architecture of insect breathing and the ways a richer sky handed them room to grow. Here's one puzzle that stops us. Why do insects today fit in your hand, while in the Carboniferous skies dragonflies the size of hawks chased prey? Nothing about their bodies changed in design, yet scale leapt forward. What shifted in the world around them to allow such bodies to take flight? Insects breathe in a way that feels alien to us. They have no lungs drawing air in, no red blood supplying oxygen. Instead, their bodies are laced with spiracles, tiny holes, leading into a network of tubes that branch and branch again until they reach nearly every cell. You can imagine their bodies like a bundle of soda straws laid end to end, each passage thinner and more divided the deeper it runs. Oxygen seeps down those tubes, and carbon dioxide escapes the other way. It works beautifully for small forms, quick, direct, no pumps needed. The trouble comes with size. Diffusion, the process that moves gases along, is lazy over distance. A molecule slips forward quickly in a short space, but over several centimetres the progress slows to a crawl. So for an insect, scale becomes a prison. Add more body mass and the centre starves of oxygen, while only the outer tissues thrive. The tracheal system has no bellows to draw or force air deeper. Past a point, breathing through straws cannot keep the heart of the insect alive. You can picture how engineers might run into the same issue. Imagine trying to cool an office tower only with open windows. On the lowest levels a breeze stirs, but 30 floors up the air stagnates. Temperatures climb not from lack of windows, but from the sheer inability of passive flow to reach far inside. That's diffusion in the insect body. It is fine for a cricket, but it cannot cool, or in this case feed with oxygen, the living skyscraper of a dragonfly the size of a crow. And yet there was a window when this limit softened. In the Carboniferous, oxygen made up about 35% of the air. This filled every breath with near double the supply we know. Suddenly oxygen could leak deeper into tissue through sheer abundance. Diffusion no longer stopped short at the outer layers. It reached the farther corners of body cells that would suffocate under today's thinner air. The size ceiling lifted. We know this link because it has been tested, not just guessed at. Scientists raised insects in chambers with oxygen set higher than normal. Dragonfly larvae, beetles, even simple flies grew with broader girth when oxygen enriched their air. In some cases the increase was subtle, in others striking. It suggested that the body still carries the blueprint for growing large, but only expresses it when the atmosphere allows. The Carboniferous forest was one giant chamber experiment scaled across the planet. But not all insects took that gift evenly. Some reached wider forms, while others plateaued. An uneven benefit spread across the arthropod world. Predators met prey with new mismatched sizes. Flies didn't mirror the growth of dragonflies. Beetles didn't match every rival. Evolution was reshaped not just by who could get big, but by who could get big enough to matter. Oxygen acted less like a blanket lifting all up equally, and more like a tilted stage favouring some performers. That uneven scale mattered. In a swamp forest, if insects could grow large and glide above, it meant prey on the ground faced aerial capture in ways unknown before. A thicker air also helped drag wings up with less effort, letting size soar in more than one sense. Aquatic forms that crept onto logs had to contend with predators looming far larger than any they evolved under earlier conditions. The predator-prey balance shifted into strange new alignments. Consider how different their bodies were from ours. We rely on a pump and carrier, lungs pull in air, blood sweeps gases where needed, hemoglobin locks oxygen in chemical hold. Our system works regardless of distance. But it has a downside. Too much oxygen bends the delicate balance. At 35% we would feel dizzy. Tissues would strain under oxidative stress. What stifles has liberated them. The very rule sets are reversed. It is easy to imagine the scene if we stood in that forest. Air rich and thick like a tonic with every breath. Fire more eager, catching even damp logs. Insects gliding at wingspans our arms cannot match. Buzzing with strength drawn from an atmosphere generous beyond any later age. The swamp itself would hum, every scale of insect pushed larger by air chemistry alone. This is the answer layer by layer. The Carboniferous raised oxygen until the physical ceiling broke. The size cap that hemmed insects in today was lifted, and when the barrier vanished, what seemed impossible, foot-long dragonflies, armoured scorpions as long as a cat, suddenly became ordinary life. What makes this mystery more gripping is not just that size became possible, but who stepped through the open door first. Because in the undergrowth of that swamp beyond the gliders, another giant crouched waiting. Scorpions far larger than the palm-sized hunters of our deserts. Step softly through the ferns of a Carboniferous forest. The ground is thick with damp leaf litter, shadows drawn long across fallen trunks. Something stirs. Two eyes, each the size of your thumb, glint faintly from beneath a mat of decaying plant matter. The rustling stops, the air presses still, and for a moment you're aware that you're being watched. Not by a mammal or bird, but by a scorpion longer than your forearm. It waits. That hunter carried a name we now know, Pulmonoscorpius kirktonis. Its form stretched nearly 70 centimetres from the arc of its tail to the curve of its claws. The fossil record places it in the quarries of Scotland, a flash of stone that caught the ghost of a creature scaling far beyond today's scorpions. This is not speculation. The slabs record its armour, the curve of its plates, the reach of its body. If we stand back in imagination, we find ourselves in a damp world where scorpions match the size of small household pets, but with none of the tame comfort. The armour of this hunter was more than surface. Its body plates locked together in segments, each a shield interwoven with the next. The broad carapace at the front, heavy with muscle anchors, narrowed to an abdomen jointed into overlapping ridges. Each segment gave strength while keeping motion supple. Out at the front, its pedipalps, those large pincer-bearing arms, swelled with muscle. The tips ended in claws shaped to grip, serrated within to clasp struggling prey. From there, a tail arched high, ending in the dark curve of a stinger. No direct evidence of venom remains in the fossil record, but every indication aligns with its modern kin. A sting designed to deliver more than pain. Set side by side with the emperor scorpion, the largest living relative at 20 centimetres, the size difference speaks plainly. An emperor scorpion in hand feels weighty enough, a solid dark crust of armour. Pulmonoscorpius, stretched more than 3 times that span, filling the length of a child's arm, pressing the weight of a cat. This is scale that matters. A scorpion able to hunt beyond insects, able to confront amphibians moving awkwardly across the underbrush, perhaps even testing the limits of young reptiles. Size shifts the menu, and here it tilted toward vertebrate prey. Its hunting method was not the chase. There, speed was unnecessary. Insects of the air and the floor delivered themselves to ambush if the hunter waited. The joints of its body carried fine hairs, trichobothria, able to feel the faintest vibration in the air. A beetle shifting in moss, the footstep of an amphibian padding through wet leaves. It could sense without sight who pressed near, and when the distance became short, the scorpion erupted into motion. The claws snapped wide, then closed like twin hammers, pinning the prey from either side. The sting curled forward, pressing venom into struggling muscle. Picture the sequence. An amphibian no bigger than a mouse labours across the damp floor. Its weight depresses the peat, its call carried low. Beneath a log lies stillness, then sudden strike. The claws crush down, lifting the amphibian from the ground in silence broken only by the struggle of limbs. A dark arc of the tail curves, then spears downward. In the slow air of that forest, the contest is brief. One strike ends it. The very air helped make this body possible. In our time, 21% oxygen supports insects of small scale. In theirs, the mix climbed near 35. That difference thickened each breath, delivering oxygen through paths that would starve an equal body today. For scorpions, which rely on book lungs that fan sheets of tissue into passage with air, the heavier oxygen turned each draw more effective. The territory in which they hunted, wetlands rich with decayed vegetation, added moisture that prevented desiccation. These two conditions, air and water, held the door open for body size to expand. As predators, Pulmonoscorpius held a certain tier alone. Amphibians ventured into damp clearings, but their size and speed rarely granted safety against claws that could crush with one closing motion. Smaller arthropods scuttling over moss stood no chance when a scorpion this large dominated its patch of ground. Its niche was not global apex. It did not tower above every creature. But at the scale of the forest floor, it was one of the most effective hunters present, a keystone weighting the balance of small lives below. Its predation shaped who thrived. The Kirkton Quarry in Scotland provided the most solid evidence. Fossil slabs carved out from the Carboniferous wetland show fragments wide and broad, long enough to trace estimates of body span. Impressions of plates, partial outlines of segments, all speak of scale outside modern reach, and yet none show the visceral parts directly. Venom glands do not fossilize, skin does not harden into stone. What we see are the outer armour and the measures between. The rest must be drawn from analogy, from the body plan of scorpions living still. The absence of venom preserved leaves questions hanging. Did the sting deliver paralysis instantly, dropping small vertebrates at once? Or did it weaken them slowly, allowing capture as muscles faltered? Each option carries a different tempo of predation. Likewise, the strength of the pedipalp sparks curiosity. Did claws kill outright through crushing, or did they only pin long enough for venom to end the struggle? Fossil shells cannot say. They hint, but stop short of certain lines. That gap underlines how much of extinct lives remains hidden. Our own senses bring weight to their form. Humans respond quickly to the sight of scorpions, the sharp tail, the armoured body, the way they move sideways with quick clutches of claws. In the modern scale, even hand-sized species stir unease. Step that image up into cat-sized form, and you invite nightmare. For early peoples to have stood in the Carboniferous, the sight would have pressed instinctive fear. An animal both familiar in shape and stretched west of expected size. Fear not through myth, but through weight of fact. And yet weight is not only measured by scourge. Giants came in varied forms. Arthropods, the millipedes 6 times longer, slid across the floor feeding on rot. It posed no threat. Strength came through armour and size alone. A grazer, not a hunter. Pulmonoscorpius. By contrast, weaponized size into predation. Where one pressed mass into safety, the other converted bulk into attack. Together they show how air thick with oxygen did not restrict bodies into a single tactic. Each creature carved its survival through very different means. The Carboniferous stands then as an interval where the rules bent. Arthropods could rise in size past the limits we see today. Some used that space to browse or recycle. Others, like Pulmonoscorpius, turned it toward menace. The forest floor was no simple path. It was a stage where danger lay hidden under every log, a stage where even a casual step stirred the watch of claws and waiting stingers. Imagine standing again in that underbrush. The plants tower above, leucopsids and seed ferns woven into a damp canopy. Pools of water reflect dim light filtered through spores in the air. Beneath the nearest trunk, silence settles heavy. A ripple disturbs the moss, a vibration not seen but felt. The air itself carries the hint of danger. Then, without warning, armoured claws snap out. The forest is not just a collection of trees, it is a ground divided into ambush and survivor. Pulmonoscorpius was not alone in reshaping risk. It exemplified how predators could use the new chemistry of air to claim scale. That claim lasted as long as the oxygen window stayed open. When it closed, body size retreated, and scorpions returned to the smaller but still potent forms we meet today. But during that high reach of oxygen, this scorpion placed a seal of fear on the forest floor. This reassures us of a broader point. The strangest of times produced not only giants of bulk, but predators scaled until they pressed into animal niches, more often reserved for early vertebrates. That variety introduces humility when we look at the fossil record. Our categories of plant, grazer, predator, apex, they shift under different air, in different heat, at different stages of the Earth. Each surge of oxygen rewrote survival for a generation of species. The gift of the Kirkton fossils is not only in the drama of size, it is in the questions they leave behind. Muscles preserved in stone can tell us width, not power. An arched sting can hint at venom, not dose. We stand then between evidence and inference. That is the work of studying deep time, not to close the gaps fully, but to walk the line between stone facts and their silent echoes, to see how far a window of oxygen can stretch possibility. If you pause to weigh these creatures, it feels clear the Carboniferous forest was not just oversized plant life with insects scaled up to match. It was a landscape where threats rearranged in unfamiliar shapes. On the ground, some threats glided unseen under log mats while others towered like armoured centipedes. Some creatures expanded through peaceable appetite, others through predatory weaponry. Diversity itself stood enlarged. For us today, the question hums differently. If higher oxygen returns, could scale rise again? The answer leans against chemistry. Carbon cycles have moved on. New fungi digest what old plants buried. Today's air rests at balance points that resist such spikes. The forests of the cat-sized scorpion were possible once, tied to conditions that have closed. That finality reminds us giants were not timeless, but timed. The forest scene we walk in imagination ends there. A predator crouches beneath wet leaves, poised not by luck, but by gift of air. The scale is startling, its presence proof. For a span of millions of years, Earth pressed the limits upward and let forms like Pulmonoscorpius reign where smaller forms now scuttle. That reign passed as conditions shifted, but the trace remains in stone, a warning preserved in silence. And size was not always the edge of menace. Among giants of that time, some floated above rather than lurked below. The air itself carried them, thick enough to hold gliders on broad wings. From scorpion on the ground to flight overhead, the Carboniferous raised giants in all directions. The next step in this record unfolds not in the shadows of the forest floor, but in the kites of the insect world that filled the ancient sky. Picture a warm, hazy air hanging above a floodplain, tall lycopsid trees rising like towers, and then across that canopy, a wide shadow drifts. Its movement is not the beating thrust of a bird, nor the dart of a dragonfly. The wings carry it more like a kite caught in a slow current of air, tilting and balancing with little effort. Sunlight filters through spore-dense haze, and each shift of the wide wings sends flickers downward, as if the sky itself were alive with stained glass. These are the shapes of insects that owned the air before any vertebrate thought to claim it. The Paleodictyoptera. They were not small, wings stretched 40 to 50 centimetres across in some species, broad enough to fill a human lap. That span set them among the largest insect ever, yet what makes them stranger still is the wing plan. 4 wide primary wings supported their body, but behind the head sat 2 smaller lobes, proto-winglets, that lent them a silhouette out of place. 6 separate wing-like structures, not 4 like dragonflies, and not 2 like birds. No direct descendants echo this exact build. Their order is long gone, leaving fossils as the only clear outline of their form. When we press these imprints against modern thought, we find a pattern of experiment where the mechanics of flight took on shapes no longer alive. To understand why these forms could rise, we need the air itself. The Carboniferous atmosphere was not only richer in oxygen, but also denser than the air we breathe today. Increased density means more support for shapes that spread wide and thin. If you think of tossing a paper glider, you know one trick. The more resistant the air, the longer the glide. A plane shaped from card travels further and steadier in thicker air than in thinner, because the molecules pushing back on the wings hold it aloft with less drop. Paleodictyoptera were like those paper crafts in a giant room filled with heavy air. They did not need frantic flapping. The forest canopy provided slow currents, and denser air translated those currents into support. What held the eye were their wings themselves, laced with veins that crossed and branched like a net. Fossil slabs show a lattice of near-perfect geometry, weaving diamond-like spaces reminiscent of spider silk or the windows of a cathedral. These veins reinforced the membrane, giving stiffness against tear, but they also mark the wings with repeating shapes that dazzle when you place the fossil under light. If a living Paleodictyopteran wheeled above the trees, the patterns may have caught the sun in glints. To us the structure feels beautiful, but the functional side was crucial. Broad wings unbacked would crumple. The venation made possible wings that spread thin across a foot or more of space without folding in mid-air, and yet in spite of their spread they were not dragonflies of power or speed. Dragonflies today beat wings with force, hover precisely, and dart out in sprints. Paleodictyoptera were creatures of glide. Their muscles and body design gave steady flight but little acceleration. They coasted rather than chased, steering broad plains above swamp forest caverns. In that glide they resembled more a released kite than a driven hunter. Their odd pair of front winglets added to this balance, whether they acted as stabilizers, smoothing the slow turns of a wide body, or whether they mark an evolutionary leftover from aquatic ancestors is still open. Evidence suggests wings may trace back to structures once used as gills. If so, then the extra lobes on these insects are like genetic echoes of life in water, still shadowing airborne descendants at that boundary of time. The head that guided this glide bore eyes of many lenses. Compound vision, the kind common to insects, split sight into thousands of facets. In the Carboniferous swamp, haze and mist were common. Tall trees vented spores into the air, shadowing the canopy with constant particulate. The light was dim and filtered, the air filled with floating clouds of plant dust. Under such conditions, wide, compound eyes offered survival. Each simple lens caught light at an angle, pieced into a wide panorama. It may have lent Paleodictyoptera the ability to sense moving forms against muted greens, to react to shapes sliding across dim backgrounds that would fool simpler sight. Some researchers even raise the idea that colour mixes and shifting patterns looked sharp to them in ways we cannot experience. What seems haze to us may have been a world of shifting tones to those ancient eyes. Pause and picture them again. A Paleodictyopteran gliding soundless above a fern forest. Its wings, stretched and patterned, are held steady against a slow current. Sunlight touches the veins, and the insect hangs motionless as though pinned in the sky. From below, an amphibian stirs in a clearing. plant spores swirl in low light, caught by every movement of air. Then, with minimal effort, the insect adjusts a wing, dips in poise, and shifts direction with hardly a beat. This was not a predator's charge. It was more like a leaf taking chosen paths through breezes, directed by nerves instead of chance. Diet marks a real contrast with their winged neighbours. The Paleodictyoptera were herbivores. Their mouthparts formed long piercers, akin to needles, that tapped plants for sap or punctured tender tissues. In place of snapping jaws, they carried small tubes that drew plant fluids. Spores floating thick in the air provided food sources. Moss pads, soft fern shoots, and sap channels in young stems all posed easy entry points. Each glide above the canopy could turn into feeding where new growth softened the plant's skin. Such feeding shaped the earliest direct interactions of insects and plants. Plants faced new stress, and over long spans this pressure led to defences, tougher tissues, chemical barriers, or spore timing. Insects in turn adapted to pierce and tap through. In layer-by-layer feedback, flight and feeding wove together into ecological change. By taking to the sky, these netwings began shaping ecosystems both by what they ate and how they acted as prey. For early amphibians and arthropods of the understory, Paleodictyoptera were food moving in the air, a resource not present in earlier times. For predators yet to evolve, their bulk signalled opportunity. The aerial food chain stretched upward once gliders filled the space. Without such pioneers, predators of the sky that came later, such as the great Meganeura, would have found an empty niche. Instead, the path was open, stocked already with flying numbers, waiting to be hunted. What secures our view of these creatures is fossil evidence spread across Europe and North America. In many sites, wings are preserved with exquisite detail, each vein, each branching pattern, pressed into stone like the skeleton of a leaf. These fossils allow paleontologists to reconstruct the proportions of the insect, the spread of its wings, and hints of how it flew. By comparing venation patterns across groups, researchers test ideas about the origin of insect wings themselves. Were wings born from stiffened gills, or did they extend from hardened outer plates of the thorax? Paleodictyopteran fossils tie into that debate, for their extra winglets lean the evidence toward a gill-derived origin. But that conclusion is not sealed. Some argue they represent unique offshoots, forms abandoned by later evolution. It shows how stone records can confirm shape, yet still leave function uncertain. The six-wing configuration adds a mystery note. What purpose did those four winglets serve? If they stabilised, then perhaps flight was more efficient, allowing wide bodies to balance like a glider with side fins. If they held no true flight role, they may have simply been evolutionary carryovers, like fingers no longer functional yet carried in bone. That ambiguity keeps debate sharp. We carry the picture of six-winged insects, but we cannot watch them fly to settle it. In absence, interpretation wavers, a reminder of how much chance we face interpreting long-lost body plans. Still, what is sure is role. They were among the first animals to rightfully dominate airspace. Birds, bats, even pterosaurs lay hundreds of millions of years in the future. At this stage, the sky was insect territory alone, threaded with gliders whose fragile bodies carried across forests. They transformed the Carboniferous not by building nests or moving stones, but by filling the canopy with motion. Hundreds of millions of years later, the fossil echo tells us here is where animals first expanded into the third dimension. They did it quietly, without fanfare, but to lasting evolutionary consequence. Seen as part of the larger story, Paleodictyoptera give us a picture of atmosphere and ecology and feedback. Plants rose into the air, building forests of new materials. Spores cluttered that air, raising oxygen and density higher. Insects responded by forming wings that caught dense air and bodies that tapped plant fluids. Each actor played off the other, one building oxygen, the other using it to rise. Later predators took advantage of the shift. Life built upon life, results stacked upon condition. That is how deep time writes, slowly, each change pressing future options into shape. And if we step outside the fossil itself, we see why this mattered. The size ceiling of insects lifted with oxygen surging. For the netwings, this meant wingspans that sprawled a foot or more across, size unfelt since. Their shape and glide were not accidents of biology alone. They were products of air thicker than ours, forests higher than before, and plant life that released spore clouds feeding a new dynamic. The fragile, almost artful wings of Paleodictyoptera were thus both symbol and outcome. They embodied how Earth's atmosphere could bend biology in directions it has not since. In the end, the Paleodictyoptera remind us that the air itself creates opportunity. They were neither aggressive nor armoured. Their survival strategy was lift and quiet feeding. Yet through that, they created a blueprint for others to follow. Aerodynamic plan, ecological role, and new predator pathways. They were not accidents. They were bridges toward a wider airborne world. And yet, the skies did not stay the peaceful domain of gliding sap feeders. The same air that lifted the netwings with such ease also carried hunters built to stalk and strike. Where one insect coasted on sunlight, another used oxygen to power, chase and kill. So as these kites of the ancient skies drifted, larger shadows formed above them. Predators tested the same atmosphere, and from that test arose something far more formidable. Meganeura, the ruling dragonfly of an oxygen-thick sky. What insect could rival today's hawks in raw aerial dominance? Not a bird, nor a bat, nor even a pterosaur. Long before any of those, a dragonfly-like hunter with a wingspan of nearly 28 inches cast its shadow across Carboniferous swamps. This was Meganeura. With a body stretching over a foot and wings that spanned wider than 2 outstretched arms, it stood unmatched as the ruling predator of the air. When it took flight, the very idea of an insect changed. It was no longer just a buzzing nuisance. This was a creature big enough to stalk vertebrates. The fossils that tell us of Meganeura were first drawn from the rocks of France in the late 19th century, their wing impressions crisp in shale. More examples would be found in England and scattered points of Europe, dating back roughly 300 million years into the late Carboniferous. Each fragment is a direct imprint, the stone recording the mesh of veins, the outline of body joints, the taper of a thorax built for power. With wings this broad, preserved in such detail, the stage is set for us to imagine flight mechanics that no other insect has pushed close to since. These fossils stand as physical witnesses, aged by hundreds of millions of years, that lay out both size and capacity. Look closely at their form. 4 large wings, each able to move on its own, created possibilities beyond beating in unison. Like modern dragonflies, they could shift in pairs or alternate. That independence gave more control, more balance, more ability to hover or bank. A head capped off with massive compound eyes, the size of marbles, supplied nearly a full circle of vision. Those eyes did not see like ours. They broke the world into tens of thousands of points, registering movement in panoramic detail. Across the thorax extended 6 long legs tipped with barbed claws. In flight, those legs folded to meet. Raised and curved inward, they locked into a kind of basket. Anything they touched was caught. Once prey hit that basket, escape was unlikely. The air of the Carboniferous was its secret accomplice. Thick with oxygen, it carried greater density than any breeze we know today. That density mattered because it gave the wings more lift at slower beats. Where a bird must work hard to keep feathers pushing against modern thin air, Meganeura floated with less effort. In that atmosphere, wing strokes could be fewer yet still hold aloft a body larger than any insect that followed. Modern dragonflies echo this skill. They can hover, drift, then dart instantly, faster in response than many birds. Now consider that scaled up. 2-foot wings leveraging dense oxygen-rich currents meant enormous holding power and agility combined in one body. Flight demanded more than lift, it demanded energy. The surplus oxygen of the Carboniferous gave that generously. Higher concentration allowed tissues to run hotter, with quicker energy release in muscle fibers. A metabolism backed by 35% oxygen supported not just lift, but hover, long chases, and the stamina to claim aerial dominance. In essence, the atmosphere itself ran as an engine behind Meganeura. Without that richness, those great wings would have been less than useless. They would have weighed the body down. The air and insect worked in union, each making the other's presence possible. So what kind of predator was it? Evidence points to a dual style: ambush and active pursuit. Its enormous eyes meant scanning and locking while hovering motionless in place. It could remain aloft like a watchtower, registering each movement in the forest space beneath. Once prey entered range, wings could adjust in fractions of a second, keeping the massive body steady on target. Legs snapped shut into the spiny basket, enveloping insects or amphibians mid-flight. The strike was near instant. In some ways, it was like a cross between a hawk and a trap. The precision of hovering, the speed of the dive, and the snare of hooked legs all merged in this single-body plan. Imagine the slow-motion replay. A giant mayfly floats upward through the mist of spores. Wings glitter in slanted light. From high above, Meganeura tilts its body and begins to bank, its 4 wings angling. Eyes hold the prey square. Then, in sudden acceleration, the body tilts forward, wings beat harder, and the legs open wide. The barbs form a cage in the air. The mayfly enters the span trapped between spikes. In one beat of wings, the angle shifts, and the caught prey is folded tight against the chest. There is no sound but the flutter of membranes and the soft tearing of wings as the predator feeds. Each strike was that efficient. Each chase exploited the physics of the air it ruled. This dominance reshaped skies in ways we still trace. Before large aerial predators existed, insects could swarm unhindered across canopies. But once Meganeura anchored the role of apex, swarms faced new pressures. Staying low to the ground became safer. Amphibian juveniles leaving water became prey not only to ground hunters, but to the looming shadow overhead. With one predator, the balance of entire communities shifted. Food webs gained a vertical axis of risk, beginning the long precedent of skies as contested space. The fossils add detail. The venation in the wings is astonishing. Latticed like grids, the pattern looks engineered, as though placed for maximum strength with minimum weight. Each vein reinforced the broad membrane against stress, distributing force across the whole surface. That level of support was critical when surfaces stretched near a metre across. Juvenile fossils suggest they began life as aquatic larvae, much like modern dragonfly nymphs. Those nymphs were certainly predatory, lurking at pond bottoms, striking out with extendable jaws to snap at smaller insects or fish-like tadpoles. Once they climbed into adulthood, they carried that predatory streak into air. The cycle of water hunter to air hunter repeats across deep time. Ecosystems show ripple effects. Prey shaped their habits in reflection of this shadow. Insects adapted behaviours that lessened their time exposed in open space. Amphibians clustered nearer to water where escape options stayed open. The presence of Meganeura forced choices across species too small to counter its attack. In that way, we see not just one insect, but a signature predator rewriting behaviour across a landscape. This theme carries throughout natural history. Apex forms, even for brief spans, create pressures that guide evolution in subtle, lasting ways. We can compare to modern dragonflies. Studies of their hunts reveal success rates climbing to 90%. Nearly every attempt ends in capture. Now translate that kind of strike efficiency to a body 2 feet wide. The math paints a world where survival odds against Meganeura were slim indeed. If you were an insect lifted by air currents, or a small amphibian that had just crawled into fern shade, that silhouette above meant almost certain death once targeted. The leap in scale did not just magnify size, it magnified danger. Think of the cultural echo if it existed today. A shadow on the ground the size of a crow, not from feathers, but from veined wings humming low. To us, dragonflies are harmless, hovering jewels by a pond. Scale Meganeura into our present, and that hum becomes threat. A predator eye would sweep the park, legs locking onto starlings or small mammals instead of insects. It would not inspire calm, but alarm. Its presence alone shows how the filtered rules of oxygen and air density shaped fear differently in ancient times. The truth is, Meganeura owed everything to its atmosphere. Its speed, wingspan, stamina, and predatory reach were all products of that window in deep time where oxygen spiked to its record high. In fuel, in physics, in predator efficiency, it capitalized on conditions we do not know today. And once those conditions faded, so too did its possibility. Never again has an insect ruled the skies so completely. And if the upper canopy swarmed with giants that burned prey from the air with unmatched control, what then of the lands beneath? Down below, the same oxygen spike carried another consequence. The forests that built this air carried fuel of their own. In atmospheres so sharp with oxygen, even damp wood could catch. With one spark, the ground world might flare. So while Meganeura claimed the heights, the forests themselves shimmered with danger, the air ready to burn. Even damp logs could ignite in this world, struck by a spark that today would sputter out. The air itself carried so much oxygen that fire needed little invitation. How does wood that is half soggy, buried in swamp water, still flare into flames? The answer is found in how forests and air drew each other into a feedback loop, one that almost no living thing today would survive. The ancient rainforests pulled carbon from the sky with relentless pace. Towering plants stretched upward, fixing carbon into tall trunks and bark, while their roots wound deep into mud. With every leaf fall and every storm that toppled a tree, the debris drifted into wet lowlands. Instead of rotting and returning carbon to air, much of this matter stayed trapped underwater in peat. The normal balance, where death feeds decay and carbon flows back out, was broken. Imagine blowing into a balloon but never letting air out. Each push swells it further, and since no pinprick opens it, the skin stretches close to its limit. That is what happened with oxygen. Carbon was buried, but oxygen, a byproduct of photosynthesis, stayed free. Over millions of years, this unspent supply built up, until the atmosphere strained near 35% oxygen. Today, we live at 21%. That rise created a world primed both to grow life large and to burn it just as easily. Forests turned into both lungs and fuse. On one hand, they poured oxygen into the sky, thickening the air we have described. On the other, each trunk and branch meant stored fuel waiting for fire. Growth and ignition became nearly the same story. It is hard to picture a greater paradox. Oxygen gave animals their breathing space, while the surplus made the very stage unstable, ready to light from a single strike of thunder. The cast of plants at the heart of this shift looked markedly different from those we know. Lycopsid trees rose with bark patterned like scales, sometimes higher than modern telephone poles. Horsetails thickened into groves several meters tall, not the thin whips we find in wetlands now. Seed ferns spread wide fronds that shaded understories into near dark. Early club mosses climbed upward, mingling with trunks until the forest resembled tightly packed columns capped in green spray. Beneath their feet, mats of mosses and smaller ferns pressed into damp floors, where shade often kept the ground in half gloom. What made these plants so unusual was their internal skeleton, lignin. This polymer gave structure, allowing them to tower above earlier shrubs. But lignin is stubborn material, far harder to break down than cellulose. In the Carboniferous, fungi had not yet evolved enzymes to split it apart. When a leucopsid toppled, its lignin-dense trunk resisted rot. Lying in wet mud, starved of oxygen, it stayed intact while layers of new debris buried it. Instead of carbon cycling back, it sank into an accumulating bank. Generation after generation of this process stacked thick mats of peat. Over deep time, those peat beds pressed under weight and heat. The water squeezed out, the organic matter baked and blackened. The result was coal. The very seams that fueled the Industrial Revolution lay down in that era. When we dig those seams today, we're uncovering forests that thrived 300 million years ago. Every brick of coal is sunlight captured by a leucopsid leaf, locked when decay failed, and bottled for millions of years until humans pried it free. Burning coal now is like emptying that ancient store back into the air in one fast rush. Yet fire had already begun its balancing act long before people. With oxygen as high as 35%, combustion was easier. Laboratory trials show that at those levels, even damp wood still catches flame. That means wildfires swept forests often, sparked by storms that passed over swamp landscapes. The fossil record leaves bands of charcoal locked in stone layers, testifying to frequent intense blazes. If the forests were oxygen factories, then lightning served as their scythe, cutting growth back whenever surplus fuel covered the land. Picture a storm rolling in above a Carboniferous swamp. Lightning forks into sky-high lycopsids. Their tall trunks, soak through at the base but resinous above, ignite with shocking speed. Fire races across the canopy. Rain follows, but it hisses uselessly against the flames, evaporating mid-air. Vegetation that spent decades capturing carbon collapses to ash in hours. Spores scatter in burning haze. And yet, this destruction feeds the larger system. By burning biomass, it returns carbon to air, trimming the surplus of oxygen and slowing further spikes. This is what makes the episode striking. Oxygen peaked not just because plants grew tall, but because no major check kept the cycle balanced, at least at first. Over time, the very fires driven by that oxygen served as the restraint. Fire became the self-limiting brake, recycling carbon that would otherwise stay buried. Earth itself built an emergency stop against runaway composition. Without that check, oxygen could have risen past livable margins for most forms of life. Instead, fire carved a ceiling at about 35%, enough to birth giants but not so high as to suffocate the world. The record of this peak is layered into stone. Coal seams show us the scale of peat burial. Charcoal lines mark fire's regular scouring of forest. Fossils of plants show the lignin-rich trunks, their patterned bark and strange leaf scars still visible in rock. Together, these traces tell the same outline, a planet where atmosphere and forest were locked in mutual escalation. Each step upward in tree height and spore release drove oxygen higher, while each firestorm pulled it down. The balance point was not calm but oscillation. It matters because oxygen's climb reached levels never repeated. Later forests grew, but white rot fungi evolved, shredding lignin at last. That kept carbon flowing back, preventing another overshoot of this scale. Other rises occurred, but the Carboniferous set the upper bound. For 60 million years, the world held an atmosphere richer in oxygen than at any time before or since. It was a one-off event in deep time, a combination of new plant chemistry, continental swamps, and poor recycling. We can trace how this atmosphere filtered through every aspect of life. Fire, as we have seen, became widespread. Insect size as earlier grew vast. Amphibians and early reptiles thrived in lush undergrowth. Yet each depended on forests staying wet and intact. Once drier climates crept in with the rise of Pangaea, the balance fractured. Fires may have reignited more often, but now with less forest to feed them. Coal beds declined in growth. Oxygen levels slipped back in answer. What giants had lived in was steady for a long stretch, but not permanent. The story of air-setting flames to sodden wood is not just a curiosity. It shows life and chemistry interlocked. Plants built forests to rise toward light. Their cell walls locked carbon beyond reach of decomposers. Oxygen accumulated as a byproduct. Fire answered by swinging the pendulum back. What looks now like natural disaster, forest infernos sweeping whole landscapes, was then part of Earth's balancing act. Without fire, oxygen might have pressed further upward. Without plant lignin, peat and coal would not exist. Every piece fits into feedback across millions of years. Consider one more image. A forest canopy lies smouldering, blackened trunks standing like charred. Spores, resistant to flame, drift back onto ash. Within seasons, young horsetails spring. Club mosses crawl upward. Ferns push new fronds. Life regains ground, feeds on open space, and the cycle turns again. Through such burn and regrow stages, carbon pulses back and forth. From above, oxygen seesaws. The equilibrium is uneasy but persistent. Forests create, fires undo, but together they keep the planet habitable. This is the payoff. Carboniferous forests did much more than furnish a backdrop for giant insects. They rewrote the atmosphere. Swamp trees locked carbon, oxygen rose to unearthly highs, and fire responded to cap the surge. Coal seams today are echoes of those forests. Charcoal layers are the scars of their burning. The oversized life forms were symptoms of a planet caught in that loop. Atmosphere is not passive. It is active player, shifting with plants, fungi, and flame. And yet surges in nature never hold forever. The same forests that pushed oxygen skyward carried fragility at their roots. When continent plates drew together into one vast landmass, air patterns shifted. Monsoons dried, wetlands shrank, swamp corridors broke apart into scattered pockets. With drying, fires gained ground and forests fell back. The moist peat beds could no longer accumulate at the same scale. The oxygen surge decayed with them, dragging down the size advantage of so many carboniferous creatures. The coal beds remind us we live among the remnants of that episode. Each chunk thrown into a furnace is stored photosynthesis, an exhalation from trees whose form died out before mammals existed. Burning it now is a fast unspooling of an ancient tape. In their time, the build-up lasted millions of years. In ours, the release takes centuries. The comparison challenges us to see atmosphere not as fixed background, but as responsive system. So when we picture damp logs that still flare into sudden fire, we glimpse a world made strange by its own abundance. Plants made the air generous. That generosity fed breath and fire alike. Layer by layer they pumped oxygen upward, until life and flame walked hand in hand. The forest did not only hold creatures, they sculpted the very sky that sheltered them, and when shifts came, that sky changed again. But surges never last. Those same forests, mighty enough to reshape the air, were fragile against climate shifts. As new mountains rose and winds drew dry across interiors, the great swamps splintered and shrank. What once spanned continents became patchwork. the swamp kingdoms that had made giants possible approached their breaking point, leaving room for another turn of Earth's long cycle. A green world once wrapped the equator in an unbroken belt of swamp forest. Viewed from above, the band stretched like a living seam around the planet's waist. Then, over time, what looked solid began to unravel. The wide blanket of vegetation broke into smaller patches, each more isolated than the last. And so we ask, how does a world that produced such giants actually reach its end? The answer begins with the slow drift of continents. Plate tectonics pressed land masses together until they fused into the supercontinent we call Pangaea. This collision raised new mountains, tall ridges that disrupted the flow of wind and storm. Monsoons that once swept steady across broad plains now faltered. Where rains had been predictable, they became seasonal or fell elsewhere altogether. Rainforests that stretched across thousands of kilometers began to thirst under altered skies. Dry intervals crept between once permanent sheets of rain. Water patterns shifted with the land. The endless wetlands that made peat in deep layers began to drain. Floodplains narrowed into channels and marshes cut to ribbons. That long span in which ground stayed soaked year-round came to an end. In its place came a new rhythm, wet seasons followed by months of parched soil. Pools shrank, rivers pinned themselves within smaller banks, and wide swamp basins dried out. What had been always wet turned into wet then dry, a cycle harsher for animals that relied on stable moisture. For the great rainforest, the result was fragmentation. Instead of a continuous sea of tree trunks and fern canopies, the land fractured into patches. Each patch still held lush vegetation, but those patches stood alone, separated by stretches of open or drier ground. Giants like arthropods thrived on range. Their large frames needed corridors of damp litter to move and graze. Break the corridor, and the living highway vanishes. Populations scattered, and isolation set in. Amphibians too lost their crossings. They needed water grids to spread and breed, and when swamps diminished into islands, their networks cracked apart. With drying came more fire. Oxygen still ran high in the air, close to 35%. Lightning could strike and ignite vegetation even without drought. Add dryness into that mix and the flames spread quicker and hotter. Charcoal deposits in rock layers show that fires reach scales unknown to our wet forest today. Blazes stripped canopy before it could recover, leaving scars that broke the continuous cover into still smaller pieces. A fire that raged too often slowed growth for centuries after, holding forest to mosaics instead of grand belts. Imagine one of those forests mid-collapse. The waterline pulls back from its usual banks, leaving cracked mud where amphibians once swam. Fern canopies, abbreviated by fire, allow more light to pound the ground, and under that glare younger sprouts struggle in ash, enriched but dry soil. Charcoal dust falls with rain like black snow. Trackways of once abundant millipede giants run out at the edge of brittle earth. Patterns pressed into soil flatten abruptly where life itself had nowhere further to go. Amphibians bore the first scars. Their thin skin demanded moisture, and their eggs needed standing water. As ponds shrank and swamps vanished into fragments, many could not breed at former scales. Species that once spread wide dwindled to remnant groups living in the few refuges that remained damp year-round. Diversity fell, sizes fell, and those holdout populations became cul-de-sacs in evolution. They survived, but cut off and diminished. They no longer fill the central roles they once had. Large arthropods shared their retreat. Arthropods could not roam if wet corridors vanished. Nor could giant scorpions ambush prey in a landscape where leaf litter dried and broke overnight. Food itself slipped too. Detritus, the decaying mass that fueled giants at the base level, fell in volume with fewer perennial swamps. Fewer corridors meant fewer feeding grounds, less shelter, and more exposure to hazards. The once dominant herbivores shrank back, contracting into fewer habitats. Predators followed, spiralling downward as their prey thinned. Here atmosphere links back. Swamps had played a double role by burying carbon as peat. With swamps in decline, that burial slowed. Meanwhile, fire grew frequent, and each blaze turned stored carbon back into air. Together, less burial and more combustion meant oxygen levels started to edge downward. The peak we picture in the Carboniferous began eroding, not because forests stopped producing oxygen, but because less carbon stayed locked away. The balance between creation and return sobered, tilting back against excess. As giants faltered, food webs rewired. Insect swarms that fed aerial predators thinned, and airborne hunting carried less reward. Predators of the sky that once dominated found themselves with fewer targets. Scavengers, more flexible in diet, outweighed specialists. In ecological chains, cascades started at the bottom. When detritus fell, the herbivores that relied on it dropped. When herbivores dropped, predators collapsed. When predators vanished, opportunists filled the space. The complexity of interactions gave way to simpler food lines better fit to patchy ground. Into that opening stepped small reptiles. They carried eggs with shells that could resist drying. Their skin held keratin that locked water within. Their lungs drew breath with greater efficiency than the book lungs or simple diffusion systems of earlier creatures. Where amphibians needed pools, reptiles laid eggs in soil. Where arthropods relied on high humidity, reptiles managed in drier zones. As swamps splintered, reptiles walked past their shrinking borders to colonize ground beyond. Their advantage was not brute size but resilience in a drier world. Soon, interiors of the supercontinent, far from rivers and wetlands, became new reptile ground. The record of this shift is not a single catastrophic horizon, but a drawn-out sequence. Gaps in coal seams show phases when peat no longer built into beds. Fossil pollen and spores tell of forest shifts, seed ferns and early conifers supplanting lycopsids. Charcoal layers continue as fire runs rampant. Across basins worldwide, the narrative follows the same arc. Peat thins, fire marks increase, vegetation composition changes. But the timeline differs region to region. Some forests collapsed early, others later. What matters is that, across the equator, the end loomed for that ancient rainforest belt. Was this collapse sudden, like doors slammed in unison, or staggered, like lanterns winking out at different times? Evidence points to patchwork. Each basin shows its own tempo. Forests failed in steps, in pulses tied to local climate and geography. Yet, summing across all, the effect is the same. A once global rainforest reduced to pockets, a slow shrink that erased the engines of oxygen overshoot. One region's collapse might stretch over centuries, another over millennia, but with enough time every pocket felt the same contraction. The giant swamp forest that fueled high oxygen thus collapsed by a combination of land shifts and atmospheric replies. Pangea's rise and the drying climate created stress. Fires fed by oxygen gained destructive range. Amphibians and arthropods bound to wet corridors contracted. Reptiles expanded into openings. Oxygen cycles bent downward as peat burial slowed. Each layer adds to the whole. Forest collapse and atmospheric correction worked hand in hand. A machine that built abundance primed its own undoing, and yet the story does not rest there. For even as forests contracted, one further change ensured the oxygen ceiling could not rise again. It came not from mountains or fire, but from a change in the smallest players of all. A microscopic guild of fungi found a new way to split the tough walls of wood itself, returning stored carbon straight back into the cycle. Their invention would lock the door on another Carboniferous world and close the window that bred giants. So the fall of giants was not the work of one blow, but the slow knit of many threads: continents, wind, fire, water, and shift in life strategy. The greatest swamp machine Earth ever hosted provided both its own fuel and its failure. To understand why we no longer see forests stretching unbroken across the tropics, filled with giant insects and scorpions, we must accept this pattern. What rises sharply eventually breaks into fragments, and in those gaps new life finds its place. Reptiles with shelled eggs took theirs, and the final hand, too small to see, arrived when fungi began to eat the structural core of wood. That quiet invention, more than any firestorm or drying wind, would define the world that followed. The belt of swamp was gone, the belt of oxygen drew down, and with it the age of giant arthropods drew to a close. The mystery remains not why they grew so grand, but why they could not hold their size once the world shifted. The answer lies not in weakness of the animals, but in the fragility of the system that supported them. The rainforest machine was both gift and limit, and it left behind a signal lesson layer by layer in coal, charcoal and fossil spores. Now we turn to that microscopic revolution. Because while tectonics and climate broke forests apart, fungi changed the very cycle of decay. They learned at last to eat what once endured, releasing carbon, lowering oxygen, and setting a hard cap on atmospheres to come. Giants did not fall because new predators rose to challenge them. They fell instead to something small, quiet, and unseen. Organisms so slight they left no shadows, yet they changed the chemistry of the planet. In the end, the downfall of swelling insects and armoured millipedes was written by fungi that learned how to eat wood in a way no creature had done before. For much of the Carboniferous, fallen trees resisted decay. Their trunks lay stacked in wetlands, half buried in water, too tough for ordinary microbes to break apart. The strength came from lignin, a stubborn polymer woven through their cell walls. Lignin locked carbon into sturdy walls that gave trees their height and their bark strength. It was a perfect shield, holding back bacteria and simple fungi. When these plants fell, much of their mass lingered unchanged, trapped in peat beds. Each new layer buried the last and carbon vanished from circulation. That absence meant oxygen collected, rising to levels high enough for giant arthropods to thrive. Consider the effect from above. Forests built higher and higher vaults of carbon, and fewer organisms recycled it back to the air. Oxygen surged while carbon dioxide dropped. Massive dragonflies coursed through dense air, and scorpions stretched to cat size. All were beneficiaries of that peculiar balance, plants locking carbon away while air filled with unused oxygen. It was a world on borrowed time, because some small organism would eventually find a way to break the lock. That shift came with the rise of a new kind of fungus, white rot fungi. Unlike their neighbours, they carried enzymes strong enough to split lignin bonds apart. To us, lignin is a common part of wood, but to them it was a vault of energy waiting to be tapped. Their enzymes acted like chemical scissors, cutting through lignin in stages. Bonds that had stayed intact for millions of years now cracked into smaller rings. Once split, other enzymes could handle the pieces. This opened carbon locked into lignin back to the cycle. A dead tree rotted, carbon escaped upward, and oxygen levels slipped downward in answer. It was not a fast wave or visible plague. No great forest collapsed overnight at the sight of mushrooms breaking bark. It was slower, more patient, yet permanent. For the first time in Earth's history, wood did not merely pile, but decayed fully. White rot fungi rewrote the rules of recycling. They broke the molecular lock that held the forest's great supply in reserve. With carbon flowing back, oxygen peaks began to break. Here is the paradox. Forests powered giants by withholding carbon, but fungi, by returning that carbon, ended the advantage. The enzyme set of white rot fungi evolved once, yet that singular change altered planetary composition. Once these fungi existed, lignin was no longer beyond reach. There would be no return to an age when lignin lay untouchable. That means hyperoxygenated skies could not return. A one-time condition of deep time had been erased by life's own experiment with chemistry. And yet fungi were not the only players taking part in this shift. Over time, termites' ancestors formed gut partnerships with microbes that could digest cellulose, a simpler but abundant part of wood. Soil bacteria tuned themselves to oxidize buried organic matter, burning through material hidden in sediments. Fire itself, already spurred on by high oxygen, joined forces with decomposition. Together, fire and fungi ensured that forests could not keep sealing away carbon in such vast measure again. Each char layer found in stone, each blackened record testifies to their combined pressure. The ripple moved outward through ecosystems. Arthropods that had drawn their advantage from rich oxygen counts began to shrink. Less air meant their inefficient ways of carrying oxygen reached limits once more. Dragonflies no longer grew a metre across. Scorpions retreated to hand-sized forms. By contrast, reptiles stood ready to rise. Their tough lungs drew in air more completely, their eggs sealed moisture within shells, and their skin resisted drying. These traits let them thrive as swamp corridors fractured, while insects lost the vast support they once had. Biochemistry, not claws or teeth, had written the advantage into new groups. Think of the forest floor before the fungi. Fallen logs could rest almost intact for centuries, covered in moss, half sunk in mud, yet still unbroken within. Today, if a tree drops, you measure its disappearance not in centuries but in decades. Within 30 years, a thick trunk may crumble half away under fungal attack. After a century, rich soil replaces most of what stood. The comparison underlines the shift. White rot fungi speed the turn of carbon so effectively that the slow build-up of oxygen, excess like that of the Carboniferous, cannot occur again. Imagine the forest as a savings account. For a long time, plants stored carbon in a vault that no one could open. They made deposits with each fall of a trunk, each burial of bark. The balance grew high, and oxygen stacked up in the sky as the other side of the ledger. This continued for tens of millions of years. Then white rot fungi memorized the code. In a geological moment, they hacked the account. The vault drained. Oxygen fell back to balance, and the giants lost their unusual supply. There is still mystery in timing. Fossil evidence links the rise of white rot fungi near the close of the Carboniferous into the Permian, close to the very point when coal deposits taper away. Some researchers suggest fungi spurred the collapse of swamps further, crushing giant lineages by eating through what had once been secure. Others suggest fungi arose slightly after drying had already fractured rainforests, finishing and sealing the decline. The debate endures because timing shapes interpretation. Did fungi strike first, or cement the fall? Stones give hints, but not firm sequence. What we can see, however, is clear. Coal formation, so abundant for 60 million years, slowed sharply after the fungi appeared. Without regular wood burial, carbon no longer vanished into seams. Oxygen receded. That change was permanent. Later forests could not repeat the Carboniferous surge because their fallen wood always found decomposers. Fungi had altered the rules for good. Life was now its own regulator, holding air in ranges that resisted the extremes of earlier eras. Consider modern forests. Fallen logs sprout fungi within months. Mushrooms, mycelium, unseen webs of filaments break wood layer by layer. Bacteria follow in their wake, shredding smaller molecules. Worms chew, beetles bore, ants carry splinters away. Within short spans, wood becomes soil. The circle completes quickly. Carbon moves. Oxygen balances. We live inside a world that learned efficiency through deep time, sealing off the conditions for gigantic arthropods and hyperoxygenated skies. And fungi hold yet another shadow over this balance. Their once unique talent defines why oxygen has not soared since. No matter how tall trees grow, their lignin is no longer untouchable. That shift is why today's world hovers stable near 21% oxygen. Fungi are Earth's hidden regulators, and their chemistry keeps giants from returning. It is striking that the greatest arthropods did not lose to combat. They were not hunted into extinction by larger rivals or swept away by storms alone. They fell because the floor beneath them now recycled what once lingered. Giants required waste and slow decay. When waste disappeared, so did their license to grow. Burned charcoal records this balance as well. Even as fungi evolved, fire carved into forests, adding another way carbon found the air again. Both mechanisms combined in feedback loops. Fire cut quick, fungi acted slower, but together they edged oxygen down from its high water mark. Earth's atmosphere grew less of a spur and more of a regulator. The collapse of giants, then, is not only the story of drying climates, but of a molecular breakthrough in decay. White rot fungi are still with us today. Each time we see a pale mush spreading through a fallen log, we're watching the same chemistry that closed the door on giant dragonflies and colossal scorpions. To know them is to see the quiet power of biochemistry guiding evolution as firmly as any asteroid or mountain range. By framing it this way, we see layers of deep time. Plants built forests tall through lignin. Lignin blocked decay, amassing carbon, raising oxygen. Giants evolved in that window. Then fungi evolved enzymes to strip lignin apart. Carbon returned, oxygen sank, giants lost their stage. Each rung followed by another, each feedback building into the next. It is a story less of violent end than of slow regulation. Paleontologists continue to trace the details. Thin sections of fossil wood reveal fungal tunnelling. Charcoal seams show joint pressure from fire. Biomarkers date the rise of lignin eaters, yet even when sequence falters, the wider arc is sound. Life created the overshoot and life ended it. That is the lesson layer by layer. So when we ask why no giants walk forests now, the answer is folded in the work of fungi. They prevent the burial of carbon at the scale that once raised oxygen high. They ensure balance by breaking down what earlier life could not touch. The atmosphere we breathe is shaped not simply by forests breathing out, but by fungi breathing in. The age of giants closed not with a predator strike, but with chemistry at the scale of molecules. Evolution turned a key, and the door to higher oxygen shut forever. What began as a hidden mycelium in a dark log grew into a planetary control system. And fungi were not alone. Insects that partnered with microbial gut allies pushed decay even faster. Soil bacteria ensured nothing buried stayed locked, and fires became frequent allies of decomposition. Each addition pressed oxygen down further until equilibrium held. The extraordinary window of hyperoxygen had closed. The result is plain. Hyperoxia was fragile, unique and temporary. Once fungi joined the carbon cycle, the world turned toward balances that still govern it now. What ended the giants was not an enemy at their scale, but biochemistry too small to see. Life ate life in a new way, and atmosphere itself responded. This is the payoff. Giant arthropods lost their sky not to clash or storm, but to the quiet learning of fungi. Deep time swung on an enzymatic invention that rewrote how death returned to soil. Giants were a symptom of imbalance, and balance returned when fungi spread. That is the detective trace left in wood and coal, in carbon isotopes and fossil seams. But the fungal story is only one chapter. To see the broader sweep, we must zoom back further, billions of years, to track how oxygen has shifted rise and fall across Earth's deep history. Only then can we frame the Carboniferous peak as a single moment in a longer atmospheric arc. This was not the first, nor will it be the last, time oxygen rewrote life's blueprint. Across deep time, oxygen has acted less like a backdrop and more like an author. It has erased certain chapters while sketching out new ones, altering creatures and worlds as if turning a page. The Carboniferous surge that built giant millipedes and dragonflies was dramatic, but in the larger arc it was only one verse in a much longer story. To see how it fits, we step back billions of years and watch oxygen rise and fall like the tide of a slow-breathing planet. At first, Earth's air carried no breath for animals at all. In those earlier stages, microbes ruled in chemical seas. They pulled energy not from light, but from minerals and gases escaping volcanic vents. Then came cyanobacteria. These tiny cells captured sunlight and released oxygen as waste. Over immense spans, their slow photosynthesis changed oceans, then skies. This shift about 2.4 billion years ago, known as the Great Oxidation Event, dragged the atmosphere from near zero oxygen to a few percent. It erased many of the microbes that thrived in oxygen-free water. Entire subways of life retreated underground or into deep mud where oxygen had not reached. It was both a mass extinction and a new dawn. The cost was high, yet eukaryotes, cells with nuclei, could now flourish. We owe our own cellular framework to that first planetary transformation. The rise did not continue unchecked. For more than 1 billion years after, oxygen wavered at low levels. It hovered between 1 and perhaps 10%, shifting as volcanic gases and microbial activity balanced each other out. Life grew more complex, but the ceiling for animal scale remained low. Large bodies could not yet draw enough fuel from air or water. The stage waited for another step. That step came during the Neoproterozoic, between 800 and 600 million years ago, when oxygen rose again, this time enough to touch perhaps 15% of the atmosphere. The change delivered a foundation sturdy enough for multicellular animals to stand upon. Before this, complexity had limits. After it, tissues could cooperate, distribute gases, and form larger, more intricate designs. It is not coincidence that soon after, the Cambrian Ocean filled with sudden innovation. The Cambrian explosion, about 540 million years ago, was as much a story of oxygen as it was a story of creatures. Trilobites with hard shells, worms burrowing through sediments, the first predators with grasping claws. These body plans needed higher oxygen to work. Predators could chase, prey could fortify. For the first time, animal life radiated into dozens of new shapes with efficiency and predation baked in. Rising oxygen did not paint the full picture, but it was the base colour. Without it, energy budgets could not afford organs, shells, and active limbs. Oxygen offered fuel. Evolution spent it in 1,000 ways. The Carboniferous stands apart as the most extreme overshoot. Tropical swamps ringed the equator. Plants with lignin-dense trunks grew to heights never seen before. Their tissues resisted decay, so when they fell into waterlogged mud, much of their carbon stayed locked. Oxygen, released as a byproduct of photosynthesis, ran unchecked. Over millions of years, levels reached 30 to 35%. Today's air remains at about 21. That extra 1/3 changed everything. Fire spread with ease, even soaking logs were no defense. Insects and arachnids grew to forms we can hardly picture. Dragonflies with wings the size of a hawk's, millipedes as long as 2 people standing head to toe. This was the age when atmosphere lifted the ceiling and animals pressed eagerly against it. Charcoal in ancient rock shows how common fires became. Whole forests burned, only to regrow, feeding the cycle. Coal deposits mark another side of the story. Carbon trapped in seams kilometres thick. The compressed remnants of swamp trees and leaves. The same seams that we now mine and burn were the source of imbalance that pushed oxygen into overshoot. Through those millions of years, the planet balanced knife edge between abundance and hazard. Too little oxygen, and giants never appear. Too much, and flames sweep the land endlessly. In between lay the one window when arthropods could reach sizes unusual for their kind. That balance broke. As continents merged into Pangaea, weather shifted, monsoons weakened and swamps drained. Fire frequency rose in drying forests. More importantly, fungi evolved tools to dismantle lignin, finally recycling forest matter into gas. Oxygen fell. By the dawn of the Permian, the peak had cracked. Insects shrank back towards sizes closer to what we know today. Reptiles, with more efficient lungs and protective eggs, expanded across the drying land. The atmospheric window closed, not with a single slam but with a drawn-out slide. Forests shrank, peat banks failed, oxygen dipped. Extinction cascades followed into the Permian and Triassic. Giants passed into trace, fossilized but no longer alive. Still, oxygen's pattern did not flatten into a single line. During the Mesozoic, another rise took shape. In the Cretaceous, around 100 million years ago, oxygen reached perhaps 25 to 30% again. Not as extreme as the Carboniferous, but high enough to influence the scale of life. Dinosaurs attained enormous forms and flowering plants spread widely. Some scientists suggest both expansions tied back to this oxygen bump. Large herbivores needed abundant oxygen to sustain massive bodies. Plants that clustered oxygen into productive tissues could expand under the same conditions. Unlike earlier overshoots, this rise lacked unlocked coal deposits or unchecked forest burial. Fires and decomposition steadied the cycle. The pulse was brief, then ebbed. From that high plateau, oxygen began a slow drawdown. As the Cenozoic opened after the age of dinosaurs, the mixture in the atmosphere shifted closer to balance. Today's 21% is the product of two opposite pulls: photosynthesis feeding oxygen up, and decay, respiration, and chemical processes drawing it down. Forests and plankton give, bacteria and fungi take. Each breath you and I pull is part of this seesaw. If one side becomes stronger or weaker, oxygen shifts. Across tens of millions of years, the tide has drawn us lower, but balance still holds. One way to picture it is to see Earth itself as a lung. The planet inhales, building oxygen with verdant growth and buried carbon. Then it exhales, as fires, fungi and respiration release that carbon back, trimming oxygen down. The lung has never sat still. It has pulled in giant breaths, as in the Carboniferous, then exhaled them into fits of fire and decay. It has paused on shallow draws for long ages, like the billion years after the first oxygen pulse. Breath by breath, the lung shapes what animals can live, how big, and with what complexity. This analogy holds well because life itself forms the tissue of this lung. The coal we burn today returns us to one of oxygen's grander moments. Those seams preserve the very imbalance that once spiked the air. Each chunk is bottled Carboniferous sky, carbon pulled down and locked away, leaving behind the oxygen surge we have traced. When we burn it, we unwind that lock. We release carbon again and shave off a fraction of oxygen with each reaction. The past returns in chemical form, but at a speed unknown to deep time. Where burial took millions of years, release now takes centuries. The chamber experiment of Earth's atmosphere runs again, but at a tempo that life has not seen before. Modern measures show a decline in atmospheric oxygen of about 0.001% per year from fossil fuel combustion. It is so slight that breath and survival are unaffected. We do not notice. Yet symbolically it ties us to a cycle as old as cyanobacteria. We add our mark to the long record. Even what feels small in scale becomes large when set against geologic layers. If the lung has inhaled and exhaled across deep time, we are nudging its rhythm with new pulses compressed into an instant. This leads to speculation we cannot avoid. Could future oxygen swings shape evolution again? If oxygen level rose higher, which lineages might expand their scale? If it dipped, which would adapt best? Insects with passive diffusion face limits. Vertebrates with lungs adjust through circulation. Marine life receives oxygen not only from air, but from water stirred by currents. Each pathway suggests winners and losers, yet we should be careful. The coal beds and fungi tell us that particular moments cannot be repeated. Conditions change, and feedbacks close doors once opened. Giants arose not only from oxygen, but also from precise conjunctions unlikely to return. So we return to the theme. Oxygen is not a backdrop, it is co-author. It has written mass extinctions into the rock, and it has opened windows of novelty. From the great oxidation event that erased anaerobes, to the Cambrian flooding seas with new predators, to the Carboniferous fire-ridden swamps and the Cretaceous forests that nourished dinosaurs, the pattern holds. Oxygen pushes and life responds, then life pushes back, feeding the cycle once more. The dialogue is never one-sided. Atmosphere and biology compose in duet. What now matters is to keep that duet visible. The air we carry in our lungs each second is product of billions of years of this back and forth. Life could not shape itself without atmosphere, and atmosphere could not shift without life. When we watch oxygen rise and fall across epochs, we're not watching background chemistry in isolation. We're reading history written with breath and fire intertwined. And when we consider our own age, it is difficult not to hear the echo. This was not the first, nor the last time oxygen rewrote life's blueprint. And from here the question falls to us. What does this sweeping oxygen arc mean for us now, breathing inside its fragile balance? The great millipedes, dragonflies and scorpions of the Carboniferous were not random accidents. They were shaped by an atmosphere unlike any before or after, a brief window when oxygen soared and the usual limits fell away. In that air, insects could grow wider, predators more formidable, and forests themselves could tip the balance of fire and breath. It was, in a strict sense, a one-time event. The chemistry that created it has not returned, because fungi and microbes learned to recycle wood, pulling carbon back into circulation and keeping oxygen in check. The giants belong to an atmospheric moment that cannot repeat. When we see those trackways cut into stone, or wings pressed flat into shale, we are looking at an exception in the long story of the air. For millions of years, buried peat allowed oxygen to swell unchecked. Then, as that cycle broke, size collapsed too. The world of giants ended not with one blow, but with air itself returning closer to balance. Deep time shows us that scale is dictated as much by chemistry as by anatomy. And here is where it matters to us now. Today, carbon dioxide is rising faster than any known in the record, driven from pre-industrial levels near 280 parts per million to over 420. That pace is new. Unlike the slow shifts of ancient cycles, we are running an experiment without precedent, injecting gases at a speed that natural systems cannot easily slow. Oxygen is steady, but the rest of the atmosphere tilts fast. The lesson is not nostalgia for giants, but recognition that Earth's air never stands still. Stability is an illusion. Every age has its own mix, its own winners and losses. The question now is simple. How fast can living systems, and we among them, adjust when the air changes again?